Oh, you thought you could escape the Halo music? Never. So we're nearing the halfway point in terms of start positions in Immortal Empires, and so far there have been some big winners and some big losers when it comes to legendary lore locations, how they fit into Warhammer lore writ large, and whether or not they'll be any fun to play. Balancing a thematic and lore-friendly campaign start with one that is also unique, diverse, and interesting can be something of a challenge. The general theme up to this point has been keeping the first 2 or 3 core lords in their Game 1 and Game 2 start positions, what I would consider to be generally lore-friendly start positions, and then granting each race a wildcard or 2 to pick up roots and plant themselves in a new base far from home. Naturally, though, rules are meant to be broken, and there have been a few that break this mold, including the Demons of Chaos and the High Elves, which have seen a bit more turmoil in their reveals. So let's go through the parts of the map that have been populated so far, and discuss the changes that are cool and good for the game, and some of the changes that are maybe pushing the envelope a bit too far, or maybe weren't thought out so well. Before we get into that, there's a fun little lore snippet that some of you guys pointed out to me when we covered the Greater Demons a few days ago, and that is the fact that Kugath Plaguefather and Nurgle would naturally be drawn to the Dragon Isles, because they're positioned near the mouth of the River Ruin. This body of water connects the Sea of Chaos in the north near Uzkalak to the Sea of Dread in the south near the Dragon Isles, helped by a little Dawizar project that saw a massive underground tunnel construct ease the flow and bear a powerful slave-driving navy through the heart of their empire. Essentially, this river ruin cools the forges located in major Chaos Dwarf cities like Zarnagrund, and as a result, the water it bears away is corrupted by all kinds of toxic sludge and noxious sediment that poisons everything it touches. This is quite possibly the most polluted waterway on the planet, and it empties at the mouth of Ruin just north of Kugath's start position. So a lot of that nastiness inevitably winds up near Nurgle's humble abode in Immortal Empires. I hadn't made that connection, so for those of you who had clarified that point to me, thank you very much. Now, the major topic of discussion over the last 48 hours has been centered around the High Elves. In particular, one angry revenant known for nailing Druki to the cliffs. Alith Anar will begin his Immortal Empires campaign in Karan Kar, one of the most important cities in the Dark Elf Empire. And though disagreeing with you guys is one of my favorite pastimes, I think I'm on board with the general consensus here that that change is not a good one for a multitude of reasons. In my opinion, the start date for the combined campaign should represent a snapshot of the Warhammer world, where the wars that will inevitably consume this planet are at a relatively neutral point, where no singular playable faction has a clear-cut, massive advantage over another legendary lord and main rival nearby. Obviously, the mechanics don't all have to be the same. They don't have to all have the same power level. Ikit Claw with his nukes, always going to be stronger than some other factions. That's fine. But I don't want a clear-cut, massive advantage in terms of territory and in terms of a war between two factions. And Alith Anar in Karan Kar throws off the balance heavily from a lore perspective when we're talking about the Sundering and the war between High Elves and Dark Elves. It represents a major shift in the balance of power between the two. If the Dark Elves lost Karan Kar, they would lose their major port that controls the Sea of Chill and the Sea of Malice. They would lose the massive slave infrastructure from which they derive their economic power. They would lose the home of their corsairs and dozens of their most important and irreplaceable black arcs, which is how they replace their slaves. So, if a slave economy lost their main port, infrastructure, and floating fortresses that allowed the practice to be a lucrative one in the first place, if all those slaves were freed and control of the inner sea at the heart of their kingdom was lost, this would be the beginning of the end for the Dark Elf Empire, period. It might begin a spiral from which they could never recover without becoming like a constitutional democracy with capitalist tendencies. Not in 4,000 years were the High Elves ever able to command and control the Tower of Despair, so to have that happen off-screen, without it being a crusade undertaken by the player themselves, that feels wrong. And I think I speak for most of us when I say we don't want the game to play itself. Alith Anar has a ton of history with the Dark Elves. He's one of, if not the best trained Druki killers in the known world, but his army is built around guerrilla tactics and bleeding a numerically superior enemy in ambush battles. CA could have put the Shadow King anywhere else in Naggaroth but one of the major cities, and in my opinion, Karan Kar, Clarkarond, Haggrafe, Harganeth, Naggarond, and Grond should all be off limits to anyone but the Dark Elves themselves. Do not give them to minor factions that are not Dark Elves. Do not give them to major factions that are not Dark Elves. This situation here is kind of like starting Hellebron in Safari or a Chaos Lord in Mindenheim. It skips too much of the important stuff, even if they attempt to explain why he's there at the start of your playthrough. And inevitably, they will. They'll say Alith Anar is here because he just invaded, he's conquered, what have you. But here's the thing. CA is not going to start Valkia the Bloody in the City of the White Wolf, and for good reason. It would be the death knell for the Empire. It would be a devastating blow that would take decades or centuries to recover from a lore perspective. So, if Nagaraith wants Karan Kar, they should have to take it with force during your actual play session in an actual siege and not be gifted to it straight from turn 1. And in so doing, when Alith Anar is in the countryside of a minor town elsewhere on Nagaroth, it makes it much more obvious that his invasion has just begun, that he's there for another of his famous raids, and that you, the player, have to make things happen yourself. And of course, this is to say nothing of the fact that both Lokir and Rakarth have questlines for confederating Karan Kar based on capturing 2,500 slaves. And this change will impact them as well, because they're both from that city. So yeah, while I don't mind some spicier starts and giving each race a bit of a wild card, I think this one takes it a step or two too far, and it's one of the few where I really don't get what CA was thinking. They might have some clarifications to unleash once we start Immortal Empires, but for now, I'm really not liking the change. With that said, there's some other lords that should be a hell of a lot more fun to play with the changes coming in the combined campaign, and though not all of them are explicitly lore-friendly, their new homes will likely improve the game. Alberic de Bordeleaux is no longer starting in the city of his namesake. He starts his campaign in Burgon, just north of the Mosquito Swamps in Lustria, and this should go a long way in making his campaign no longer feel like Alberic de Generic. We did get a short clarification from CA Will, who said he won't own any land in Bretonnia at the beginning, and that his previous capital will be under the supervision of Aquitaine, but it can be acquired through the standard Confederation technique, so this will not be a dual start. Same thing with Emmerich of Calidor, who will still have his early mission for confederating on Ulthuan, but is otherwise not a dual start like Malus or Eltharion. Now personally, I like this change of scenery a lot for him. Lewin is staying where he should be in Couronne, the Fae is staying in Carcassonne, Repance is going to continue her crusade in Araby, so it's good that we have a lord, especially one focused on the sea, moving to a new location where he won't just play like a lighter, less flavorful version of the Lionheart. In Lustria, you'll have enemies you rarely, if ever, get to fight in Warhammer 2, and there's some cool throwbacks to the old Hammer lore here as well. Burgon itself is from White Dwarf number 204, released all the way back in 1996, when I was but a wee lass of, lass I'd think is girl, wee lad of 4 years old, and it was a Bretonnian colony established by one Baron Marcel of Paravon, who erected a crusading city near the temples of Tlaxlan, Soothsayer. As is often the case with old world colonists in Lustria, they set out for gold and glory, and in so doing, they stirred the wrath of the local lizard people by accidentally stealing some old ones' plaques, alongside all the other gold and precious jewels that this land don't care about at all. They got into a big battle because of it, and while the outcome is not known, I don't believe we ever hear from dear Marcel again, so either he'll be joining Alberic's entourage as a secondary generic lord, might be a fun throwback there. Remember, this all happened in 2510 of the Imperial calendar, so 8 years after the start date of Warhammer 1, or Marcel perished, left a derelict colony in his wake, and Alberic's coming to pick up the broken pieces and fix the mess he left behind when he was chopped in half by a Maqueedle. Either way, it's a cool nod to the lore and will be a much spicier and more interesting start position than Bordeleaux, so I'm all for it. As for Tzar Boris the Bear, it should come as no surprise that Ursun's expedition is no longer in Uzkalak, but is instead moving into the Chaos Waste near Bloodfire Falls and the Frozen Sea. His new start position is the Tower of Torment in the far north, surrounded by presumably demons and some of those new Warriors of Chaos characters that should be on their way soon. That'll give his faction that whiff of desperation that goes hand in hand with his source material, and of course, gives him a much closer rivalry with Chaos, which is kind of what Boris is all about. For one, this new start matches his monologue in the Warhammer 3 announcement trailer much more closely, and by extension, his original lore as well, where he met his end crossing the River Lynx into Troll Country, rushed headlong into a Kurgan army on top of Erskine, his bear, and was cut off and cut down after being surrounded by a horde of screaming barbarians. Not the smartest play, maybe not the sharpest tool in the shed, but he'll have a chance to redeem himself here after being moved from the Darklands. So why is he no longer in Uzkalak, you might ask? Well, we gotta make room for the Chaos Wars, right? Expect we'll have 4 new lords and a whole new roster there before the end of the year. And the final change I want to highlight today is Nakai the Wanderer, and I'm quite happy with his new start position as well. For one, the clue is kinda in the name. You can justify putting Nakai pretty much anywhere you want for the sake of fun, flavor, and diversity, without really breaking lore. Again, as long as it's not traumatically impacting another playable faction. And we kinda knew he was moving anyway, to make room for Be'lakor on Albion. I don't think you'd really want to put Nakai and Be'lakor both on there. Traditionally, it's not been a very large island. In Warhammer 2, I think you could pretty much move across the entire island in 1 or maybe 2 turns. So they would inevitably wipe each other out right at the start, and you don't really want that. So not surprised he got moved. I do think we'll be getting more Be'lakor news tomorrow, so stay tuned for that. But Nakai is now going to begin his campaign in the Tower of Ashung in the southeast of Cathay, near the border of Koresh. This area is connected to the Serpent Estuary that flows into the Jade Sea, and the jungles of Qian to the west, which likely have some chaotic and Tzeentch influence, and may even be tied into the Monkey King and his people, and that's an element of Cathay lore that I am really excited to see fleshed out. I think Cathay, more than any other race, will benefit tremendously from having DLC. Their roster's gonna get a lot cooler and a lot more interesting once they get some lore packs. And there's also that element of the unknown that I think makes things really interesting here too, because we don't really know exactly what Cathay is going to get. We do know exactly what Chaos will get. We have a fairly good idea of what the other races will get in terms of DLC. Cathay is a bit of a wild card. Anyway, back to Nakai. He's going to have access to the sea lanes that carry him back to Lustria, should he so wish, but starting as a horde faction in exotic eastern lands, far from support or the rest of Lizardmen sub-factions, I think will be really fun from a gameplay perspective, even if I doubt that his actual mechanics will be made much better. The fresh start should at least partially make up for some of those downfalls that his faction will inevitably experience as not really being everyone's favorite DLC campaign, but perhaps just as importantly for some, he has a good reason for being there. He has a lore reason for being in Cathay. We know from Cathay lore and interviews with Andy Hall that the Celestial Dragon Emperor and the Moon Empress have big plans for ridding the world of chaos, and perhaps even terraforming the planet once more. And as ancient, wise beings that were here before the old ones, those plans will inevitably bring them into conflict with the Great Plan, the Lizardman Purification Odyssey, which is pretty much why Nakai exists in the first place, right? As an extension of the old one's will, relying on instinct to show up in those dire moments when he's most needed to turn the tide. Or in this case, throw a wrench in all this dragon shit and stop their scheming, get the world back in order so the reptiles can take over. Mark Zuckerberg, eat your heart out. So yeah, for the rest of the changes, nothing too shocking yet. Cathay starting in Cathay, Norska starting in Norska, go figure. But we've got a bunch more on the way, and once enough of those elements of note have revealed themselves, we will dive back in and discuss the changes that are actually worth discussing. In the meantime, I played a ton of cool multiplayer battles with the new Regiments of Renown, and some modded battles as well. And we've got the Be'lakor blog and new information coming tomorrow, so stay tuned on that front. We are finally getting back in the groove and on the final approach to the combined campaign and the release of Immortal Empires, so should be a fun time. See you guys in the next one. Indie Pride, signing out for now.